Welcome, young and old, gay and straight, married, single, bisexual, transgender, welcome. People of all colors, cultures, and abilities, welcome. Noisy, wiggly babies and children of all ages, welcome. Rich and poor, powerful and weak, believers and questioners and questioning believers, welcome. Welcome, all you who seek God's graceful, open-hearted love and the beautiful new world that love makes possible. Welcome to Brentwood Christian Church.
Let us pray. God of all people, we come here as your church this morning to worship you in community. May we listen with our hearts as you call each of us by name, as you speak in the silence, in song, in scripture, in reflection this morning. May we continue the legacy of the saints of the church, saints like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who nonviolently worked for justice and equality for all people. Move us in this time of worship that we heed the call of Christ to build the kingdom of God here and now. Amen.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first edition of Conversations with members from our church. We are very much looking forward to sharing in conversations over the next few weeks with folks from our church. We've had a hard time as a church family being able to maintain connections with one another, and one of the things we're really focusing on here in the early weeks of 2021 is building connections with one another as a community the best that we can. And we are so excited this morning to welcome Lola Butcher. Lola has been active at Brentwood for goodness, well over 10 years, I would think.
Probably, yeah.
And we are going to be pairing the conversations that we have with folks from our church with different saints in the history of the Christian traditions. And we're going to be talking about different themes that intersect with some of these saints. And with us celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we wanted to talk to Lola a bit about some of her background and some of her history in working for racial justice. She's been a real leader for us here at Brentwood in that regard. And so, Lola, just from the beginning, whenever you think about the life and legacy of Dr. King, what comes to your mind?
Well, hi everybody, and thanks so much for this opportunity. Really appreciate being invited to be with you today. You know, one of my, I guess, favorite quotes from Dr. King is, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I have often taken great comfort in that. It gives me comfort to hear that every time that I hear you, either of you have used it in many sermons. And I hope he's right about that. Dr. King was not infallible, and I think that on that point remains to be seen. And so I often think, what would Martin Luther King think if he came back today? And on the two issues that he was most active in, racial justice and poverty, I think he might be kind of pleased and surprised on a few points, but overall I think he would be disappointed in the progress that we've made, and maybe even shocked at the lack of progress. And that's what I think about Dr. King.
You know, Emily and I have, as clergy members, are part of what's called anti-racism and pro-reconciliation training with the Disciples of Christ, and it's part of really keeping our credentials as ordained ministers withstanding in the Mid-America region. And Emily, I wonder if you want to say a little bit about the ARPR program?
So the ARPR program in Mid-America, really, they made a decision that they wanted to have it be a strong presence in our region. And so the region partnered with the national ARP, I guess it's ARPR Ministries, or it's kind of an arm of the Disciples of Christ, but they partnered with them to have some trainings, and I think they took place in Jeff City, and there were a number of people from Brentwood that attended those trainings, and I know that you were one of the people that went up kind of as a Brentwood delegation and participated in those trainings, and a lot has kind of come to fruition. Maybe the seed, I don't know if the seed would have been planted at that, but I wondered if you wanted to share some of your experiences at that training and maybe what's grown from that.
Sure. Well, that was probably maybe 12 or 13 years ago. It was quite some time ago. Yeah. And it is that kind of event is something that I would have absolutely never occurred to me to seek out on my own. Phil, I remember exactly where I was sitting when Phil called me, because it was one of the first times he'd ever called me, and he called to ask if I would attend this event. It was a weekend event in Jefferson City, something called Anti-Racism, Pro-Reconciliation, and I said yes. And the other person that went from our congregation was Gary Morrison. And so we drove up together, and I remember on the car, as we drove up, we were discussing how we had no idea what we had really signed up for. I remember Gary joking, you know, we were the only two suckers that didn't have anything going that weekend. And Phil had just gone through the church directory and found the first two people that couldn't think on their feet fast enough to come up with an excuse not to go. And we were making fun of like anti-racism, pro-reconciliation. I remember Gary just sitting in the car, what does it even mean? You know? And so, at any rate, once we got there, what the event really was this team that I think was at a regional level or maybe a statewide level of Disciples of Christ, both clergy and lay leaders, mostly from St. Louis, I think maybe a few from Kansas City, mostly from black congregations, although there were some also white leaders. And at any rate, the purpose of this was a super intense event. It started on Friday evening, all day Saturday and Sunday morning. And these leaders had also recruited some members of their congregations to participate, sort of to facilitate the proceedings. And so right off the bat, it was probably, as I remember, about 50% of the people in the room were black. And that's just not, a circumstance that I'm that familiar with, or at that time was very familiar with, and certainly in a church setting. And so just that was like, okay, all right, so this is, I'll say, uncomfortable. At the time, I would have been uncomfortable even saying that I was uncomfortable. This is where I was. However, over the next 48 hours that we had together, these leaders guided us through this series of very interactive little discussions and exercises. One thing, the purpose of which was to help us understand the topic of white privilege and introduce some things about it. And I'm sure I'd heard the term white privilege, but I had certainly let that pass right over my head. And by the end of the weekend, I had experienced every negative emotion a person can. In fact, my palms are sweating a little bit now, as I was introduced to these concepts that really, put me through the emotional ringer. And the main thing was a feeling of defensiveness and a worry that anything that I said was going to either make me seem defensive and either, reveal something that wasn't true about myself, or even worse, reveal something that was true about myself. And so that was quite the experience. Yeah. And just to keep on with this, so because of my extreme discomfort, I would have blocked that whole thing out and never thought about it. But one of the components of that experience was that everybody was required to go back to their home community and do some kind of a project, based on this new learning that we had had. And and they were going to call, and so I wasn't going to get out of it, so I had to have something to say. So anyway, from that, I decided that my project was going to be because I had been a reporter in Kansas City covering minority business affairs as one of my responsibilities as a reporter. And so I had always been struck by how few black businesses there were in Springfield. We'd just moved here a few years earlier, and how few black people, but how few, there just wasn't any black businesses, and that the city and the school district and the public entities didn't seem to ever have any responsibility for either, for contracting with black businesses, which is just as part and parcel of the way public life is conducted in Kansas City. And so that had always been something I was kind of interested in. So I decided to do this little panel discussion, bring a few, city planning kind of people and civic leaders together for a Saturday morning conversation. And I invited Phil to be the moderator of this, expecting it to be just, a dozen people, and I'd get my question answered, and most importantly, be able to tell the ARPR people I did my project. I mean, that was the main thing. However, coincidentally, and I had no idea of this at the time, I don't know if Phil was aware of this or not, but within the larger community, the Chamber of Commerce had been becoming aware of and kind of concerned about this. So in fact, once I started kind of calling around to invite people, people were super interested in this. I mean, major leaders. And in fact, I remember making a cold call to City Hall just to find out what kind of a contracting officer would be the person that I should invite to my event. And a few hours later, Greg Burris, who was fairly new as a city office, was in my email saying, I'd like to be there. And so, at any rate, it turned out to be a very much more high-profile event than I expected it to be. And from that, some of the people that were there included Wes Pratt and John Oakey Thomas and Lyle Foster, who, not really because of that, but kind of in the same time range, were planning to start an organization which has come to be known as Minorities in Business. And they invited me to be a part of that founding team, and I was on the board of directors for a few years. And so that turned out to be, a super important, part of my life. And
I attended that, so I know Phil was, you were the facilitator or the moderator kind of
Something
role,
like that.
yeah. And I remember I attended it because, I was like, oh, this is cool, this thing that Lola's putting together, and so I attended it, and it was a fantastic event. And I learned so much attending that event. And I also found it interesting, like one of the things that kind of sparked in my mind was the importance of diversity in economic, for lack of a better word, prosperity. Like that communities, it's advantageous economically for communities to cultivate diversity and to have diverse voices represented and all this. And I remember lamenting that, so that's what's going to make us do the right thing is money. I remember having that moment of, well, of course. But then also thinking at the same time, hey, you know what? If this is what brings people to the table and gets these important conversations started, then maybe that's not such a bad thing, But anyway, I thought it was an excellent thing. And I was like, this is so great that Lola has pulled this together. And so just wanted to compliment you on that. I mean, it's firmly planted as a very important event that I have attended in my time in Springfield. So
terrific. Well, thank you for saying that. Yeah. And I will add that John Oakey Thomas, who has attended many events at this at this church, because we have a lot of events, and he is the incoming chairman-elect of the Chamber of Commerce. So I think that really does show. It's an example of how change is possible in Springfield.
And also like a convergence of a number of different things happening at once. And
yeah, it was a really important time in the life of Springfield, and we've seen a lot of growth from that. I mean, as you think back to that kind of period of time in your life and kind of where we are now, has anything shifted in your mind, or the things you feel like you've learned or grown? Where are you at now, maybe in comparison to where you were 10 or 12 years ago?
Well, I feel that, the more I learn about racial injustice, sometimes the more I despair about it, in a way. And so one of the things that has been, really important to me is that here at Brentwood there's been so much programming specifically focused on racial injustice, and it's always to me so inspiring to see how many members of the congregation are super interested in this topic, because whenever there's an event, whether it's a special one-off event or there's a Wednesday night series or whatever it is, if it has to do with issues of racial injustice, there will be a big crowd and people will be super engaged. And likewise, when I'm out in the community at events, if there's anything to do with racial injustice, I know I'm going to see Brentwooders there, and not just one or two. I mean, likely one or both of you, but other people, and people that I wouldn't necessarily even think of as being particularly interested. Oh yeah, if you go to Brentwood, you're interested in racial justice. So I mention that because I believe that one of the reasons that is true is because I've joked with Andy about this. There is never a sermon, regardless of what the topic is, that one of the two of you will not find a way to somewhere slip in a little parenthetical statement that asks us to check our white privilege and to remind us that we do live in an unjust world and that it's our responsibility to work towards justice. And I think that when that is just hammered in time and time and time again, it really, does make a difference in how people think and, more importantly, in how they act.
I sure hope so. I appreciate you sharing that. One of the things you mentioned earlier, when you were at the initial ARPR training, that you were uncomfortable and how you're even uncomfortable about being uncomfortable. And there have been lots of times, including still in my life, today, I've been at a number of those kinds of events over the years, but I notice levels of uncomfortability, and sometimes that does make me really defensive. And there have been times where people have tried to invite me to lean in to what is making me feel uncomfortable, and a lot of folks who have tried to let me, instead of just trying to feel defensive, where are you at a point, Phil, where you can learn, and what do you need to learn? Could you say a little bit about leaning into what makes us feel uncomfortable at times, especially as white people, whenever we're considering this work?
So, well, one example that I was thinking about is after you invited me to attend this is one of the special events that I attended here that really made a big impact on me in a way that that surprised me was, and this was many years ago, Phil, there was a panel discussion or panel right here, and it was, I believe it was all black men. I believe it was all men, and I believe they were all black, although I don't remember exactly all the details. However, the purpose was they were going to tell about their personal experiences interacting with the police. And I, of course, was aware of, police mistreatment of black men, in a vague way, but it was kind of an abstract concept. And my personal interactions with the police here in Springfield have been so universally positive, and in fact, really some fantastic experiences, that I certainly wasn't concerned about any, inappropriate behavior on part of Springfield police. And so, as these individuals, were telling their stories, nobody had any kind of examples of brutality or anything that was even all that bad. However, every one of them, and I do remember Wes Pratt was one of the speakers, and every one of them had, not just in Springfield, but any place that they lived or any place that they had traveled, been pulled over by the police or, questioned at an event or whatever. And while none of the individual instances were really all that troubling or disturbing, the drumbeat of repetition that they all had these experiences. I remember sitting in the audience, because I remember exactly where I was sitting, and thinking, I'd been married to Andy about 30 years at that time, and I thought, in all these years, he's been pulled over by the cops one time, I believe, and it was because he was speeding in a construction zone. So, I left that event thinking, the world that I live in is really quite different from the world that these men have experienced. And one of those anecdotes really made an impression on me, and this is Chris Taylor, who you both remember. Chris Taylor's a young black guy that was a member of our church at that time, and he had several instances in which he thought that he had been pulled over by police because of the color of his skin. And if I'd heard one of those, and in fact I think he had actually told me one of those in a personal conversation one time, and to be perfectly honest, I completely dismissed it. I thought, people get pulled over. That was I didn't say that, but that was really what I internalized. One of the things that he talked about that night is that he had been at one of the nightclubs downtown, and he had witnessed some kind of an event in which police needed to be called, and he was trying to share some information with the police about something he had seen, and ended up being treated as a suspect and actually, being detained in a police vehicle for a while. And, we knew Chris, and the guy is a competitive bowler, for God's sake. The police do not have to be worried about him. And yet the fact that he had been, in my mind, really harassed, really, stuck with me. So, any rate, a couple of years later, probably maybe 2 or 3 years later, I stumbled upon an opportunity to see Springfield police officers interact with a young black guy. And if I hadn't have heard Chris's story, I'm sure I would have just walked on by, nothing to see here, and it's none of my affair. But because of that, of knowing how Chris had been treated, I stood there to watch, and I was a witness. And I was troubled by what I saw, and I'm sure I talked with you about it, and I might have told you about it as well, because I was disturbed at the time. And, time passes, but fast forward to 2020, and George Floyd is murdered at the hands of the police in Minneapolis. And since that time, as you're probably aware, some leaders from the NAACP chapter here in Springfield and the Black Lives Matter movement have been trying to work with our local police department to get some policies changed in the hopes that we never have a George Floyd incident here in Springfield. And I have not been part of any of that work. However, I've been, kind of trying to pay attention to it and thinking, if I could, do anything to try to advance that, I would certainly like to do so. So last fall, the Springfield City Council had a series of, I think they were called listening sessions or maybe something like that. Anyway, one of which was specifically race and police. And I thought, I'm just going to go tell what my story was, what I saw. And, it's old, there's nothing to be done about it, and just like these black men that told about their interactions with the police, it's really a minor thing, almost a nothing thing. On the other hand, if I lend that story to everything else that the police, and actually the police chief was at this event, so he did hear it personally out of my mouth, but the city council members and everybody else are hearing, you know, maybe that will make some kind of an impact, just like these guys' stories did. So I brought my remarks, and if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to share what my story was, in the hopes that, you know, somebody might hear it and it might change their perspective the way Chris's story did mine. So my story goes back about 6 years, but I've been worrying about it ever since it happened. It was a hot summer evening around 4th of July, and my husband and I were taking a walk around downtown. And we were on Park Central West over by Hertz Donuts heading toward the square when we saw a couple of police cars up ahead. As we got closer, we saw 3 police officers, legs spread, elbows out, surrounding a young black kid, just towering over him. He was maybe 14 or 15 years old, and he was on his knees with his hands in handcuffs behind him, and he was in a little alcove in that building that used to be Woolworths. So he was completely encased in either the back of this little doorway or these 3 burly police officers over him. And there were a couple of other police officers also on the scene, and I said, "Hey, what's going on?" And one officer approached us and said, this young man was brandishing a weapon on the square. Well, that of course sounded serious, and so Andy and I just decided we're just going to stand here and see if we can kind of figure out more of what's going on. And while we were there, one officer was going through this boy's telephone, who's this, you know, asking him all these questions about the numbers in his phone. A couple of other police cars arrived, and they had their lights flashing. It felt like we were at the scene of a major crime, which I thought we were, you know, somebody pulling a gun on the square. I assumed that we were waiting for a paddy wagon to come take this kid to jail, but after a while, a regular car pulls to the curb. It was his grandmother coming to pick him up. One of the officers had been sort of babysitting Andy and me ever since we had walked up, and I said, "Hey, what's happening?" And he said, "Oh, he was playing with a water gun on the square, so we're releasing him with a warning." At the time, my main thought was to wonder whether, if the boy had been white, there would have been such a display of police force. And of course, I'll never know. I don't know what the situation was before Andy and I came upon the scene, because maybe the police had good reason to be so forceful when they first apprehended this young man. And I don't know whether playing with a water gun in public is a crime. But I do know that by the time that Andy and I arrived, this young boy had been thoroughly subdued, literally on his knees with his hands tied behind his back. There were at least 6 other officers on the scene. Nobody was in danger. The area was not cordoned off. The street wasn't blocked to traffic. Andy and I were close enough we could hear this kid whimpering about his handcuffs being too tight. And yet, police cars continued to arrive with their lights flashing as if backup was needed to control a dangerous situation. In the years since, I've thought of this incident every time we learn of a police-involved shooting of a black man. Inevitably, part of the narrative of these situations, either in the media reports or in conversations with people about the latest shooting of a black man, someone will say, if he had just acted right, yes sir, no sir, here's my license sir, his death could have been avoided. And I always think, what previous interaction with the police, maybe going way back to childhood, did this man have that made him think that being evasive or aggressive was a safer choice than acting right and being submissive toward the police? And to the point of my story, I suspect the young guy that Andy and I saw that night is about 20 years old now. If he sees police lights in his rearview mirror, whether it's a routine traffic stop or he is the suspect in a crime that should be adjudicated in the courts, regardless of the situation, what is his thought process going to be? Will he think, based on his personal experience, I know how Springfield police officers treat black teenagers who are playing with water guns, so my best course of action is to try to make a run for it? And if he does, then what happens next? That's my story.
May we hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Lola, thank you for sharing with us this morning.
Sure, happy to.
In the name of God.
Let us pray. Eternal God, in the reading of the Scripture, may your word be heard. In the meditation of our hearts, may your word be known. And in the faithfulness of our lives, may your word be shown. Amen. Amos 5:18-24. Alas for you who desire the day of the Lord! Why do you want the day of the Lord? It is darkness, not light, as if someone fled from a lion and was met by a bear, or went into the house and rested a hand against the wall and was bitten by a snake. Is not the day of the Lord darkness, not light, and gloom with no brightness in it? I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them, and the offerings of your well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. May we hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Good morning again, everybody. So we are reflecting on the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. this morning as part of our series of A Great Cloud of Witnesses. And tomorrow, of course, is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and there's a lot of time spent reflecting on the words of Dr. King. And really, when we think about the saints we're looking at in this series, he is the most well-known figure. I mean, at least in American history.
For sure, for sure.
Maybe Francis in world history and such. But just because a person is really famous, it doesn't mean that we get the gist of what they're talking about. In fact, it's easy to oftentimes ignore parts of the message of the prophet. One of our personal heroes, someone who might be viewed as like a living saint, the Reverend Dr. William Barber. He's a Disciples of Christ pastor. He's the co-leader of the Poor People's Campaign, which was started to follow up on the work of Dr. King. He actually has this to say about prophets that become very popular. The best way to destroy and distort the legacy and message of a prophet is to reimagine him as popular. The best way to destroy and distort the legacy of a prophet is to reimagine him as popular. Now, why do you think Dr. Barber shares those words of caution with us?
Well, when we talk about Dr. King in today's context, I mean, you find people all across the spectrum, politically, religiously, who will quote Dr. King. It's really in vogue to quote Dr. King. And it's really easy to forget that in his time, he was not very popular. Dr. King was a divisive figure. There were people in positions of power that were actively working against him and working to silence him. There were people in Congress who were wanting to silence him. The President of the United States wanted to silence him. And it may not be necessarily because some of those people disagreed with what he was doing, but it was disturbing the peace, right? It was agitating people. It was getting people worked up for change, which meant the status quo wasn't going to be the status quo anymore. And anytime that happens, that's uncomfortable. And so he was not a popular person as far as the people who were in positions of power were concerned. But now everyone loves him, right? Or maybe not everyone, but a lot, generally across the board, people really, they lift him up as a hero, right? The hero of the civil rights movement. And that's just, we are far enough removed that it's really easy for us to forget how he was viewed.
Yeah, we actually have a video to show you. It's from another Reverend Doctor, the Reverend Dr. Michael Eric Dyson. We are going to begin a book series here at Brentwood this coming week on Dr. Dyson's book, Tears We Cannot Stop, A Sermon to White America. And here in this short video, he says a bit about the legacy of Dr. King and how often it is forgotten.
When you think about it, the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. has been severely whitewashed. My name is Michael Eric Dyson. I'm University Professor of Sociology at Georgetown University, and I'm the author of Tears We Cannot Stop, A Sermon to White America. What I mean by that is that we have completely denied the legitimate radical elements of Martin Luther King Jr.'s image, identity, and ideas. We have frozen him in 1963, where he delivered one of the most remarkable speeches in American history, the I Have a Dream speech, that captured the moral aspiration of King. But many people have frozen him there, as if he believed that was an achievement, not an aspiration. As if we had already in America come to a point where we were no longer judging people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now many conservative white brothers and sisters and many radical right-wingers of all races have attempted to distort Martin Luther King Jr.'s memory, to whitewash him of the social context of his racial ideas. Furthermore, Martin Luther King Jr. was far more radical at the end of his life. Martin Luther King Jr. had more than one speech. Like a great singer, he had more than one album. I Have a Dream is a great hit, is a great song, is a great, if you will, part of his legacy. But he delivered other speeches. He said, I saw my dream turn into a nightmare in another speech. He talked about the violence in American society and the refusal to acknowledge the humanity of black people. He talked about riots as the language of the unheard. He He spoke to America the day before he was murdered and said, "America, all we ask is that you be true to what you said on paper." He also began to say that most Americans were unconscious racists. He began to challenge the notion that America was a racially blind, racially neutral country, and he began to argue that many Americans would not come to grips with their own racist beliefs, ideas, and practices. That's a much more radical Martin Luther King Jr. than we're used to talking about and listening to, and only when we recover that king will we recover the full dimension of his radical, if you will, position in American letters and certainly in American leadership culture.
A lot of times people confuse what it means to be nonviolent and to resist, and Emily is going to reflect a little bit on that for us.
So nonviolence, so a lot of people will look at terms like pacifism and tie pacifism and nonviolence together. They're not exactly the same thing. Nonviolence at the heart is active. It's not something, it doesn't mean just sitting back and doing nothing. So, you know, when we are participating in nonviolent acts or in nonviolence, we're not like being a doormat. We're not letting people just barrel over us and do whatever they want. We are actively resisting systems of oppression, actively resisting injustice in ways that are nonviolent. So we're doing that without weapons. You know, like we're not bringing guns, we're not bringing clubs, we're not bringing knives, you know, we're not bringing those kinds of things. But it's just the power of your presence to disrupt. It's using your body in a nonviolent way to disrupt. And a lot of people forget that. We talk a lot about peaceful protests, but the second they become disruptive, people want to call them violent. But disruptive does not equate violence. Of course, there are occasions where things have devolved into violence, but every time something's disrupted, that doesn't mean it was a violent act that took place. Just because your road that you drive to work on is shut down because of a protest, that doesn't mean it was a violent protest. Sometimes nonviolent actions can be disruptive even in the midst of meetings. For example, I joined a number of people from across the state with coalition of people. I was there as part of Missouri Faith Voices, but there was a broad coalition across the state of people of faith who were standing in favor of Medicaid expansion. This was, oh gosh, I'm not sure. I think it was actually back in 2013. Or 2014, it was in 2014. And I, along with several other people of faith, we went up into the balcony of the Senate chambers at the Missouri State Capitol and disrupted a meeting because the calls for expansion of Medicaid were just being ignored. They were not being heard, and so we participated in a direct action that was nonviolent, but it did disrupt. You know, it did stop the meeting. They had to stop that session because, you know, we were doing call and response and just calling on them to expand Medicaid. So those are things that are nonviolent actions, like, and they're direct actions that are meant to disrupt and are meant to point a finger to injustice and to signal injustice. Putting yourself in a place where there's no ignoring that there are people crying out for injustice and trying to call your attention to something.
Yeah, and the way that we see different responses to protest in the United States is very telling.
It is.
I know this has been all over the news, so this is not like you all don't need us to tell you this, but whenever Black Lives Matter protesters gather in Washington, D.C., and they are met with the kind of presence from the National Guard and various police forces in the area, in comparison to what happened on January the 6th, especially whenever there was plenty of warning out there that violence could occur, it just is all too revealing about how, in the words of another Reverend Doctor, Jackie Lewis, I'm so tired of living in a country that treats black grief as a threat and white rage as a sacrament.
But this reminds me of something that I think it's really important to lift up. So one of the things I think that went through a lot of people's heads on January 6th as we watched the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol a lot of people were thinking, oh my gosh, if those were black protesters or brown protesters, this scene would be, this would be a bloodbath. Not because of the actions of the protesters. I don't really call the people who broke into the U.S. Capitol protesters.
But it's a whole nother level.
So, but it would have been different, right? We would have seen a lot of death and brutality had the people who breached the Capitol been black or brown. But I think it's really important for us to point out that that what happened at the U.S. Capitol and the Black Lives Matter rallies are two entirely different things. I have heard so many people say, why are you speaking out against what happened on January 6th? You were totally silent in the summer. You know why? Because what happened in the summer is not the same as what happened on January 6th. They are not the same thing. What happened in the summer were millions of people taking to the streets to cry out against the extrajudicial killing of black men, and to also point out the grave injustices against people of color that are perpetrated and perpetuated in this nation. And that's why people were going to the streets. And the people who were going to the streets for those protests, and I mean, we participated in some here in Springfield, were met with potentially violent resistance. Because when you are met with people who are in full militarized gear, that is threatening. And that stokes fear. What happened on January 6th was a group of people who broke into the Capitol building to stop the certification of an election.
With zip ties.
Yes, and weapons, with the intent to cause harm. We are finding out
incredibly.
I mean, they were calling for the death of the Vice President of the United States. Make no mistake. So we should not be minimizing what happened or trying to do this both side thing, because Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives, that is a totally different thing. And so we should not be speaking about those in the same breath.
Yeah, Dr. King was very adamant that in the process of trying to disrupt and the process of trying to find another way forward, you don't play by with the same tools of the oppressor. So in other words, you do not adopt the tactics of the oppressor. In the process of trying to overcome these kinds of things, racism, poverty, militarism, you don't become that which you hate. You don't become that which you despise. You instead rise above it.
Well, there's a church member that posted something on Facebook. I won't name the church member just in case they don't want me to name them, but they talked about what it means to take the high road, because there's so many calls for unity right now, especially from one side of the aisle. But there are a lot of calls for unity, and this person lifted up that, taking the high road doesn't mean just saying, oh, unity, let's hold hands and sing kumbaya and let's all get together. That's not what taking the high road means. Sometimes taking the high road means pushing for change. Sometimes it means calling out injustice. It just means we're not going to do it at the barrel of a gun.
Just because we are oftentimes in this society talking about dismantling white supremacy, this doesn't mean that white people, in terms of racial identity or in terms of trying to understand themselves as being supreme to others, it doesn't mean that leads to a full, whole self. No, that fractures oneself. That destroys oneself. White supremacy does not just destroy people of color, it destroys white people as well. It's a cancer fatal to the soul. And while there are very different ways to think about the most important work that needs to be done, and changing policies that discriminate against others, that are inequitable, that are rooted in racism, those policies have to change. There needs to be justice and equity for people of color, and that has to be at the center of all of the work for dismantling white supremacy. But with all of that said, we need to also remember that part of Dr. King's message is that white supremacy kills the oppressor too. It fractures the soul of white people. And the gospel comes to bring life and bring life to the full, and that means also restoring, mending, healing, repairing the fractured white soul, the acts of white supremacy and the acts of racism, the hatred, the hostility, the toxicity, that is symptomatic of a fractured soul. And Dr. King, while always advocating for persons of color front and center, changing policies, changing procedures, changing laws that are unfair and unjust, standing up for integrity and dignity for all people, well, that was always at the center of his work. He also talked a lot about the way that white supremacy destroys white people too, and how the gospel calls us to restore all people.
I think the thing that it's important for us to keep at the forefront is justice for black people doesn't come at the expense of white people.
Right.
And it's really telling that so many white people seem to think that it does.
Well, there's a narrative they're given.
Well, as the state, because white power has come at the expense of people of color.
Yeah.
It has come at the expense of black people. Yeah. And so when that's how you understand power, then you think that if another group were to get power, that's how it would come. It would be at the expense of white people. We're talking about freedom for everybody here. You know, when we're working for the equality and justice for people of color, that applies to everybody. That's for everyone. We are all free when black people are free. You know, we are only as free as the least free person among us.
And now may the sacred Spirit, made known to us in Jesus Christ, go before you to show you the way.
Go behind you to push you into places you would not necessarily go yourself.
Go beside you to be your companion.
And dwell inside